Welcome back to On the Shelf for another one-shot.
Without further delay, we're going to jump right into a pool of 80s nostalgia.
The focus of this one-shot, Saturday Morning RPG.
For the sake of full disclosure, we'll let you know that Sol and I each received codes for the game for free, but this will showcase our honest experience.
Saturday Morning RPG for the Nintendo Switch comes to you from Mighty Rabbit Studios. You can hear more about the early days of Mighty Rabbit directly from Josh Fairhurst and Douglas Bogart during our interview with Limited Run from Episode 3 of the On the Shelf podcast.
The game's development began back in 2010 by a team founded by Josh in connection with the now-defunct Joystick Labs video game incubator project. Joystick Labs provided each of the selected groups up to $18,000 in seed funding, experienced mentorship from members of the game development industry, facilities to create and develop in, and additional services such as legal, finance, and marketing.
After 2 years of continued development, Saturday Morning RPG's first episode was released back in 2012 on iOS for Apple devices. Since then, it has seen subsequent development and release on Android, Windows, OS X, Linux, the PlayStation 4, the Vita, and now the Nintendo Switch.
Bringing Saturday Morning RPG to the Switch seemed an almost foregone conclusion the moment that Limited Run announced that they would be bringing games to the Switch. With the love that Josh and Doug have of many things 80s paired with the Renaissance-like experience we're seeing with the Nintendo Switch, seems like an easy choice to bring the game to the hottest platform as one of Limited Run's early titles.
But the journey to the Switch doesn't start with a physical title, it starts with a release on the eShop. Saturday Morning RPG is available now, and we're taking a look at what the game has to offer. For the most part, the game is structured like a traditional JRPG, with free roaming about the map and occasional interactions with enemies. The game is broken down into episodic portions, mimicking the style of cartoons from the 1980s.
In our conversations with Josh and Doug, we learned that during the game's original development, Episode 2 was meant to be the original first episode. However, that was changed prior to release.
I think that the only thing I can say before diving into the content of the game is that it's definitely not as visually pleasing as most modern games. It shows its age almost immediately. However, that is not to say that this makes it a poor game. I definitely got pulled right into Episode 1's little storyline, although it felt exactly like the thin plot to an episode of G.I. Joe or Transformers. It feels like the first episode is blatantly engineered as a bit of a tutorial, which is a decent idea, though to me that did cause episode 1 to feel forced. Overall, I think the play mechanics introduced in the game, as well as the different binder covers, stickers, and items, give you a wide enough variety during enemy engagement to keep the enemy battles interesting. If I had one complaint, it would likely be about the balance. There were times at which I felt like some of the battles were tilted pretty far in the enemy's favor. The simple fact that during battles, the enemies would have multiple hits against you as a player, not so slowly whittling down your health meter, all the while you're taking multiple turns to power up, attack, and then potentially regain health if you make it to that point. It should be noted, though, that these are minor points that didn't really detract from me continuing on to the next episode.
Yeah, I noticed that especially with the enemies in later episodes, that they would be able to attack more often than it felt like they should. It didn't really feel super turn-based in that sense, which is kind of what you would expect going into an RPG. But it did have an interesting battle system. I would be very interested to find out how they would have done a tutorial system had Episode 2 been the first one, because Episode 1 relied sort of heavily on you learning the game there, and Episode 2 didn't really have any of that. So I would like to see how they would have done things differently. But I will say that I didn't really have an issue beating the enemies in the game. Them being able to attack me, there was only 1 or 2 times that it became a super issue, and that was more towards Episode 3 and Episode 5, especially when you're fighting against the robots. But in Episode 1, I didn't really have any issues. They attacked more often, and you'd be spending an entire turn just powering up most of the time. I would have liked the sneak attack mechanic to have been better, because there was times when I would come in behind an enemy and I wouldn't get a sneak attack because the game, I guess, expected that you were going to have to fight that enemy. So even if you came in from behind or slightly behind to the side, it still wouldn't be a sneak attack. And all sneak attack really did, is probably my main complaint, is it would give you a 3 times multiplier to start, and that's it. Like, you wouldn't get an early attack. Like, you wouldn't be able to attack first it would just be a 3 times multiplier, and then if you tried to use it to attack, if your enemy's speed was higher than yours, they would get to go first anyway. And I didn't like that. But that's also one of those small issues that it really doesn't affect everybody. So
I felt like the ending to the first episode was a bit of a token ending. But it definitely does stand out that when you're done with that, you're now where the game really meant you to begin in the first place. And with the second episode, I can say that the gameplay does take a turn for the better in regards to opening the world up a little bit more. Battles seem to escalate a little bit better as you progress into the further depths of a level, and it's definitely no longer a tutorial. From what I played from here forward, the game is much the same at its base level. And if you like Episode 2, it's probably a safe bet that you'll continue to enjoy the rest of the game. You'll continue to encounter friends and foes, gathering stickers and items, and going through more of the nostalgia-filled storyline.
The enemies do change a lot once you get past Episode 2. The battles are pretty much straightforward. Some of the weapons that you can use, even though they do have limited uses, they do add to different things that you can use throughout the fight. They have some that have a meter you need to fill up. They have some that have a meter that you need to stop a marker on. Depending on where you stop is how good your attack is. And they even have some where, say for instance, the compass, it comes down from the top of the screen and you have to hit the button at the right time in order to do maximum damage, or any damage at all, really, because I was only able to hit it once, though I didn't really try more than maybe 3 times. The one thing I will say about the combat is they did add kind of like a weaknesses system where the fleshy people were more susceptible to your magic attacks, if you want to call it magic attacks, but the robots, they were more weak and susceptible to your basic punch attacks, which I thought was kind of odd, but it did play out well that they added that in, so you weren't just using the same attack over and over again, especially since your magic attacks were limited on each fight. But the thing that I did enjoy was that in between each fight, all of your magic was restored and all of your life was restored in between each battle. So that was kind of a nice turn. There's no out of combat items that you use at all. There are side quests that have you collect items, but they don't have any use other than picking them up and taking them to where you're supposed to take them. Sometimes you didn't have to take them anywhere, just collecting them would end the quest entirely. But really, to get back to the combat, the strategy didn't come into play until later on, especially in episode 5 when you had to deal with enemies that could call other enemies. The order of how you fought and beat each enemy became important. So that added a new flavor to it. But the downside for me anyway, and I don't know how you experienced this, but once I found certain stickers, I used them the entire game. Like there's some stickers I started with that stayed on my notebook. I did change my notebook cover a couple times, but for the most part, the stickers pretty much stayed the same with the exception of maybe 1 or 2. And
I can add a little bit to that there in the sense that when I saw the sticker system for the first time and how that worked, I felt very much like this was a min-max area of the game.
It was. It felt like it was a min-max area of the game. And I will tell you that playing the game in handheld mode makes scratching those stickers much easier.
Yeah, I jumped on top of the left stick every time I anticipated combat. I would just jump on and just start waggling the Pro Controller's left stick as fast as possible. And usually from there, I could get a handful of stickers in without an issue.
Yeah, the difference between using the Pro Controller and handheld for me was Pro Controller I would get between 3 and 4 pretty reliably. Occasionally I'd get all 5, but when I was in handheld, I got all 5 pretty much every time. And that I don't know if it's because of the size or the amount of distance it had to move on the stick, but it did become easier. But going back to that, though, the not having to change the stickers, I also never really changed my weapons. I did add the pizza so that I'd have an additional heal, which came in handy because it used multiplier, which was nice. And I did add the axe because it was a one-time use, but with a multiplier, it was pretty much a one-shot kill on just about everything except for bosses. So I did switch those two out. The karate bandana I also put in because it gave me more of a defense on enemies that would rush in, so that you could knock them away instead of taking damage from them even if you block, which is something we get into in a minute, is the blocking system. So I used the record disc, the CD, the entire game. I used the cookie the entire game. Once I found my stickers, I used them the entire game. And once I got those 3 weapons, I used them the entire game. I did try to use a couple others, like the sword and the compass, and I didn't really enjoy those and how they worked, so I went back. But the game, pretty much, if you play it on the default settings, you can play the game from start to finish pretty much with what you start with for the most part, because by default the enemies scale with you. So there are ways to make it harder by changing how the scaling works, but by default the game wasn't extremely hard. So it has JRPG features, but it is most definitely not a JRPG in soul.
No, and as far as the weapons go, I really did appreciate the use of the Michael Jackson glove. Right off the bat, that felt a little bit overpowering at times.
I did try that. I tried that a couple times.
Yeah, and then once I acquired the, let's say, pseudo Optimus Prime truck, I enjoyed using that to be able to hit the entire group of enemies as well.
I felt it was too unreliable for me. I used it for a little bit, but I'd hit maybe 1 out of 3 enemies, and it wouldn't always do a whole lot of damage, so I swapped off of that.
The other thing that I found was interesting is that you could actually charge multiple turns in a row.
Yes. There is an exception to that, sort of. If you are using the bandana and a enemy runs up to you and you do use the counterattack that the bandana grants you, it will use your multiplier. Really, the only thing we can really say about the blocking system is that you're going to take damage even if you do block, but the degree of your block based on when you block is going to give you additional multiplier and potentially help sway a battle more in your favor. I think the entire time from start to finish, the entire playthrough, I maybe died out maybe 4 times. And that was mainly because I was taking so much damage from the blocking system. And poison, a lot of poison.
I'd agree with that. I'd say that most of the time when I found myself dying, it was because of my own mistakes with the blocking system. The only thing that you really need to do with regards to the blocking system, aside from timing, is to ensure that you recognize the types of attacks from the various enemies and time your block to meet the type of attack from the specific enemy. Once you've memorized each of their specific attack types, it's really rudimentary at that point to just wait for the correct moment to press the button.
Yeah, some of the later enemies even throw out like multi-attacks. Like they'll shoot out 3 shots or 2 shots or 1 shot, so you kind of have to be prepared to block 3, even though it's not going to be 3.
They do introduce that earlier on with some of the enemies hitting you multiple times, but usually those earlier enemies are only taking 1, maybe 2 ticks off your health each hit. So to me, it was clear from the very start that Saturday Morning RPG hits the nostalgia note extra hard. You've got countless nods to 80s pop culture that comes through not only in the characters, but the art style, music, dialogue, and general themes as well.
There are some subtle and not so subtle nods to pop culture. I mean, the game's probably worth playing through once just for that, but there is a lot more here. I found myself humming the music in places, and not to spoil anything, but the music playing during the last sequence of the game really caught me off guard because there was lyrics, and I felt like I was playing the ending montage of an 80s action movie. It was extremely enjoyable. Through various tweets and even in our interview with Limited Run, Josh Fairhurst has expressed outward interest in developing a sequel, and there seems to be a desire to revisit the game and bring something updated to the fans.
Here's an excerpt from our interview that gives a little insight into where they might be headed with a second installment.
For the sake of the sequel, if we get to make it, we would have the resources to pay Vince more money for a larger, more custom soundtrack. We'll have more money to pay for better concept art. The team itself, like my programmers are all working on, they were working on Bard's Tale 4 in Exile, and kind of doing this AA RPG game for In Exile. And the artists are now working on Wasteland 3 for In Exile. So they're doing art for these games that are either AA or AAA, depending on what you qualify them as. And my team is just so much better than we were back in 2010 in every regard, where given the chance to make another original game, it would really shine. And I honestly think it would end up pretty high in terms of reviews, because the design in Saturday Morning RPG and the gameplay was never what was severely flawed. It was the kind of like lack of overall polish, because you could tell that the game was kind of built by a new team. So there's a lot of heart, there's a lot of love in it, and you can like see that while you're playing. But the sequel would kind of give it a chance to shine. There's a lot of gameplay stuff that I would want to do in a sequel that I couldn't do within the confines of the code of the original. So I don't know. There's just a lot of room for the sequel to really be something amazing and special. So I'm just hoping that the Switch release finally kind of financially justifies Saturday Morning RPG's existence, so that we can look at that sequel and say, like, let's jump in and do it.
And just based on some of the preliminary talks, I'm really excited, just because it's a little bit darker without giving anything away, like the way you're changing everything about it. I'm just excited to see it. Like, we've already seen some concept art. It's looking good. Like, I'm hoping that it's something we can do.
Yeah, and Vince Nicola is going to be doing some new music for it. That's going to take some influence from, like, Ron Wasserman's Power Rangers soundtrack. So there's going to be some, like, really fast-paced, like, heavy metal style stuff with Vince's synth stuff, because we're kind of making a move into, like, more, like, of a 90s aesthetic there. Like, I'm dialing back references because I'm sick of people saying it's like the Ready Player One of video games. So, like, I'm really dialing back the references as much as I can for the sequel, kind of letting it stand on its own. And I really want people to see what we're capable of as a dev studio now.
Ultimately, if you're a fan of JRPGs with a little action involved, and if you've got a craving for some of that sweet 80s nostalgia, I'd say this is for you. But I'll give you the final word on this one. What do you think?
I'd agree with that for the most part, but I will stress that if you're looking for a challenging JRPG, this isn't it. It's great for what it is, but this is not an RPG with an extremely flush story or epic boss battles. It takes what it does, and it does it very well. And that is being a fun, mindless time sink with heavy RPG elements. The addition of Endless and Arena offers some replayability, and the relatively short playtime comboed with the interactive battle system makes for a neat little quick play. But this is far removed from games like Final Fantasy or Persona, and that is completely okay. This is not trying to be those games. It's fun, it's quick, it has some really great throwbacks and homages to classic pop culture from my childhood, and I love that. And if they do a sequel, I plan to play it too. If there's nothing else but to see where they innovate the different systems they've used.
Thanks for checking out our one-shot review of Saturday Morning RPG from Mighty Rabbit Studios.
If you like this review, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe.
To hear more from Limited Run, don't forget to check out episode 3 of the On the Shelf podcast.
We go in depth with Josh and Doug about Saturday Morning RPG, their entry into the Nintendo market, and more.
Until next time, this is Soul.
And this is Cyrix. Thank you for listening.